Hello, everyone, and welcome to Eugene Mennonite's recorded church service for June 7th. Going to start with lighting of the peace candle and a moment of silence. A year before the Iraq War started, Eugene Mennonite Central Committee sent a delegation to Iraq, taking ceramic oil lamps made by Dick Lehman. As part of this effort, U.S. churches were also given oil lamps to pray for peace in Iraq. We continue to light our oil lamp each Sunday as we remember Iraq and other places in need of peace around the world. Let's do the Lord's Prayer. Our loving spiritual caregiver, may we always reflect your true nature. May justice be established and your loving will be fulfilled in our cities and countryside as it is in heaven. Give us and the poor all the supply we need. May we receive your mercy as we grant mercy. Lead us not into overwhelming difficulties, but deliver us from our nation's sins. Amen. Now our opening worship. In a time of deep grief, loss, and suffering, not only for ourselves but for the whole world, some of us find ourselves overwhelmed by sorrow, overwhelmed by anger, overwhelmed by denial, overwhelmed by depression. May we remember that there is a force in the world that daily, continually creates love, that establishes justice for the oppressed, that renews hope for those in despair. May we rest in the presence of God, who is love and is leading us all to peace. Okay, so now it's time for the hymns, and you'll just scroll down to the hymns, and you get to sing along.
Hi, Steve. That's actually Jerry's turn. So Jerry's going to read the scripture reading. Thank you, Jerry. If that recording, you're like, I don't know that I could hear that very well, you could just go down below this video, immediately below this video on the website, and there's a better recording of Jerry saying that. So you could actually listen to that. So it's right there. All right. So in Diane's and my backyard, all of a sudden there are dozens of oak trees. Just all over the place. There's just oak trees everywhere. And we found out that gangs are coming in, bringing in acorns and planting acorns all over our yard, in the front yard, in the backyard, everywhere. These gangs gangs of squirrels, had been coming in and planting all these acorns. And then we get oak trees, just get a ton of oak trees. And anyway, if anyone wants an oak tree, we've got a lot of them. Okay. Anyway, but beside all that, the funny thing about an acorn, it seems to me, is something that's commonly known, but it's just funny to me that if you take a look at an acorn, it has all the genetic material that a tree has. Everything is there. It's all there. Everything that grows into the tree is there in the acorn. And if you plant the acorn under right conditions, it knows the tree that it is going to be. That it's all right there. And that's kind of like the way that Jesus' sayings work. So Jesus' actions and Jesus' sayings are like an acorn in that they're brief and compact, and they can grow into something that is much bigger than the saying itself or the action itself. It can grow bigger than that, and that's the whole idea. Now, Jesus, of course, didn't use the acorn; he used a mustard seed. He said, "Mustard seed. You plant a little teeny mustard seed, and it grows into a big. It grows into a big thing." But we're going to use acorns because we're in Oregon, and that's what we got here. Anyway. So the thing is that Jesus, one of the mustard seeds or the acorns that Jesus gave us is sell your possessions and give to the poor. So sell your possessions and give to the poor. That's he wanted us to obey that. But the thing is that sell your possessions and give to the poor in and of itself is kind of like an acorn. Yes, all the genetic material is there. All the basic principle is there. But it still needs to grow into a tree. It's not done growing. So we can say, okay, I'm going to sell my possessions and give to the poor. I'm going to sell what I have in my house, and then I'm going to take that and give it to the poor. Okay, finish that command. Check that one off. That was just the acorn. Jesus wants us to have a tree. What does the tree look like? The tree looks a lot more like a whole mess of people doing it together to create a bigger response. So for instance, Jesus wants us to heal people. He healed people. And he wants us to follow in that and heal people. And there are people who do heal people exactly the way that Jesus did. They do it exactly the same way. They set up healing rooms, they pray for people, and that's great. There's no problem with that. That's a really good way to do it. But the tree of Jesus' acorn is more like hospitals. Hospitals were originally established by Christian organizations to provide a bigger way of healing a lot of people, that healing people one by one person going to one, can't do. So a acorn is going around town praying for people for healing. The tree is like a hospital. It's healing a whole ton of people all at the same time. That's kind of what it is. And you say, well, does that really work? Is that really what's going on? Well, let me just go back to sell your possessions and give to the poor. So the first and second generation Jesus followers, of all the commands that Jesus said, they took that command most seriously. If you look in the New Testament, you'll see more applications of sell your possessions and give to the poor than any other command that Jesus gave. It pops up again and again and again. And so for them, though, it didn't just stay with one thing. So, for instance, Jesus said, sell your possessions and give to the poor. One of the applications of that is in Matthew 25. We have the statement of the sheep and the goats. It's not a parable. Everybody says it's the parable of the sheep and the goats. And yes, sheep and goats are a metaphor, but that doesn't mean that the whole thing is a parable. It's not a parable. It's just a statement. It's an eschatological statement. Anyway, it's so you take the sheep and the goats, and you have an application of sell your possessions and give to the poor. So you've got all the specific ideas. So if you see someone who's hungry, you feed them. You see someone who's thirsty, you give them drink. You see somebody who's ill-clad, you give them clothes. You see somebody, or you know of somebody who's sick, and you visit them. And then you have somebody who's in prison, and you visit them. That's the basic core of the sheep and the goats, and that is an application of sell your possessions and give to the poor. But if all we do as a church is have food banks and clothing rooms, and that's the whole application of sell your possessions and give to the poor, we have not finished the work that Jesus actually wants us to do. He wants us to go bigger than that. He wants us to go broader than that. He wants us to apply it in a bigger way. Because sell your possessions and give to the poor isn't just supposed to be this one action that I do for you. It's supposed to be a tree. And the first and second generation of Jesus followers understood that. They got that. So the passage that Jerry read is from Acts chapter 2. And we've got, and so we have a very small group, actually not that different from Eugene Mennonite Church. Okay, maybe a little different. They were small groups that met in different places throughout Jerusalem, but each individual cell was maybe about as big as Eugene Mennonite Church, maybe 25 people, 25 to 50 people, depending on how many people fit in a room. And so these folks, when they met together, they said, "Okay, we're going to obey this command." So the first thing they did is they kept up Jesus' work, and they kept healing people in the way that Jesus healed. But we also have, but then they did other things as well. It says that they sold their possessions. So they specifically applied what it is that Jesus did to their possessions. They were selling it, and then it says that they held everything in common. Now, a lot of people say, "Oh, well, see, that means that they kept all their possessions together in one place, and then they redistributed it." And one, so you had certain people like the apostles figuring out how they're going to redistribute it. Well, that's not exactly what happens. The holding everything in common, what the phrase actually means is they didn't take any of their possessions to be personal possessions. Nothing that they had was specifically theirs. So if somebody else was in need of it, if they had extra clothing, they would provide clothing for other people. If they had an extra piece of land, they would sell that piece of land and then provide money for the poor. That's what it means. So they would just say, "Oh, well, you have a need. Well, let's meet that need. Let's do that right now." And then they anyway, and so that's what they were. And then you had people who would invite each other to each other's houses for dinner. And sometimes they would do that because they just wanted to hang out with other people who were Jesus followers. But a lot of times it was because somebody was a little short on food that month or whatever. Nowadays we'd say that month. They were short on food, and they would invite them over to dinner so that way they could share the dinner. So some people had larger dinners than other people did. They would just say, "Hey, how about everybody come to my house to dinner? We got lots of food. Come on over." And then they would share that. Once again, that's a way of having everything in common. My dinner is not just my dinner. My dinner is for everyone in need as well. So that's what they did. As time went on, then they got a little bit more organized. So somebody would sell a piece of land, and then they would give the money to the apostles, and then and say, "Okay, if you know of anybody who's poor, then you distribute it to whoever it is that you know." And then the apostles at that point saw that a lot of people needed meals, and instead of having people go to various people's houses, they would have a central location that they would offer meals at. And then eventually it was realized that the apostles didn't have enough time, that they couldn't actually meet everyone's needs in the meals or the giving and distributing money, and some people were being missed. And so what they did is, okay, well, we're going to appoint certain people, and that's just going to be their job. We've got a multitude of things to do, so we're going to appoint some people, and their job is specifically to help people who are poor, to make sure that they get fed and make sure that if they need any money, then they can get some money. And those people were called deacons, which in the Greek, actually, in the original Greek anyway, that means wait staff, people who were waiters. And so deacons were waiters. Because they actually literally, they were people who literally waited on tables. They served people at tables for meals. And so they had this kind of it was a more of an organized kind of welfare. It's actually what they ended up coming up with isn't that different from, let's say, Food for Lane County or Catholic Community Services. Same kind of stuff. See people in need, see people with food, give them food. See people who have financial needs, provide them with the finances that they need so that way they can make it for another week or another month. It's pretty basic. The funny thing is that this also became the central characteristic of the church. The early church was so serious about sell your possessions and give to the poor that every church, the main characteristic of the church was not how they worshipped or not the things that they believed, but whether they were serving the poor. And when the church really got organized, by the time the 3rd century came rolling around, if you didn't have a ministry to the poor, a feeding ministry to the poor, or a giving ministry to the poor, then you didn't get called a church. You weren't a church because you didn't have this. You could screw up on worship. You could screw up on other things, but you can't screw up on giving to the poor. That is a basic characteristic of the church. And then another thing that was actually very common, another way that the early church, the first followers of Jesus, that they sold their possession, gave to the poor, is they provided hospitality. Now, nowadays, if you think hospitality, it means giving somebody a good handshake, or making sure that people feel welcome, or following Martha Stewart very carefully to make sure that you can do everything in the right way, and all of that. They understood hospitality a little bit differently. In fact, probably the best way that they summarized hospitality is by talking about foot washing. So in the Old Testament, you've got, let's say, Abraham and his nephew Lot practiced hospitality. You've got people who are strangers or immigrants or refugees. They would be passing through, homeless people. They'd be passing through, and you would make sure that you provided them with food and some shelter for the night, for their own safety and for your own health. Well, the thing is that what that ended up being is, for anybody who was traveling, this idea of hospitality had 3 different characteristics. So the first thing was to make sure that their feet got washed. Why? Because they were on the road. They've been on the road, they've been traveling. And so you want to make sure that they're kind of cleaned up. Secondly, then you give them something to eat. And thirdly, you give them a place to stay for the night. That was hospitality. Jesus summarized it by calling it foot washing. He just took the first of those 3, and then said foot washing. So when he was telling all of his disciples to wash each other's feet, he wasn't just saying, make sure your guys' feet are clean. He was saying, practice hospitality in this way. Make sure that nobody comes into a town and doesn't have a place to stay or a meal to eat. That's a very basic thing. In fact, it's really funny because Jesus sent his apostles. The first thing he did first thing they did as a church is he sent his apostles from town to town to see if those villages would practice hospitality. And we may talk about that later another time. And so the thing is, hospitality is still an important thing, where people who have extra rooms could be providing overnight accommodations to strangers and things like that. That's all. That is all part of what has to be done. There are other things the New Testament talks about as far as helping the poor as well. There were people who provided job training in the New Testament, provided poor people job training, so they had an occupation to be able to do that. They also other folks took collections from wealthy people or from churches all over the world to be able to provide for a place that was struck by a disaster. And then there's plenty of other things that happen. If some people would just come up to the door and say, "Hey, I need some food," and you needed to make sure that you provided them with food, there are all kinds of examples in there. And so when we look at how we can use our resources to help the poor, we don't need to limit ourselves to just giving to the poor. We're looking for bigger things, just like the church started small and then grew big. Even so, we need to look at our situation and we need to say, well, how is it that we can help poor people? And this is something that actually Eugene Mennonite Church does really well. What do we do to the situation that we have right here? We don't want to limit ourselves to certain kinds of poor people. We want to make sure especially that we help people who have a lot of prejudices against them, who are being helped, just like they did in the New Testament as well. So nowadays we want to make sure that we're helping refugees and Palestinians and African Americans and the homeless, the Kurdish peoples, the Native Americans, and find ways that we can specifically help all of these folks. How do we do this? We can take extra rooms and find ways to give people a place to stay. We can take our finances and provide housing. We can loan our books or vehicles or other possessions to others. That way we're not keeping it just to ourselves. We can recognize, for example, that homeless people need not just a tent, but they need a permanent, secure place to stay. And we can support them specifically that way, or we can be part of a larger organization that provides housing for people. And also helping the poor, we can sign petitions to stop oppression, or we can attend protests. It's an interesting thing this week. I haven't been in a protest for a while. This week I've been at 3 protests. Anyway, keeping busy, And at Eugene Mennonite Church, this is what we've been doing, and we're doing it. We are fulfilling Jesus' commands: sell your possession and give to the poor, in the kind of way that the New Testament writers, the early Jesus followers, did that. I still want us to remember a few things, though. Just a few things that I'd like us to remember. First of all, we need to remember that it's easy to get caught up in giving to organizations or attending fundraisers, but we want to remember to give directly to the poor. Jesus' command still holds: sell your possessions and give to the poor. So we still need to give directly to the poor. When we see a poor person, let's see if we can help. Also, we don't want to just focus on the second half of the command, but also the first half of the command: sell your possessions. We need to keep looking at what we have. Keep looking at what we have. Reevaluate. Do we have extra clothes? Do we have do we have a windfall? Do we have something that we can give away or provide? Is there something that we have that it is more important for somebody else to have it than us? Something we have to constantly remember. And then finally, we also need to remember that sometimes we're the ones who are poor. And sometimes we don't need to focus so much on giving as receiving. We need to allow us to have our needs met as well. we can be destitute, and we can be heartbroken and suffering and struggling too. And we need to allow ourselves, recognize when we're in there, and receive love from others. And receive love from ourselves as well. If we are to be people of mercy, then we need to be willing to give mercy to everyone, and sometimes that includes us. That's what I have to say today. The sermon, I got more to talk about. Okay, so some announcements first. All right, it looks like we are probably going to be ready as Eugene Mennonite Church to meet next week, to actually physically regather together in one place. Now, where that place is going to be is kind of still up in the air. We're still in discussion with Wellsprings, the school, about whether we're going to be able to meet as a whole group in the building. It's looking pretty good, but we haven't gotten the official approval yet. And so we will let people know. If we can't meet in this building, it is absolutely legal and totally okay for us to meet somewhere else, like maybe somewhere outside. So probably, if we can't meet in the building, then we'll meet somewhere else. We'll find somewhere else to meet. A couple things, though, that the board wants us to remember: that when we do get together, we're going to have some basic rules, basic policies, just for everybody's safety. Everyone's going to have to wear masks, and we're going to need to try and keep 6 feet away from each other's households. Anyway, if you're living in a household, don't have to stay 6 feet away. But anyway, so those are a couple things that we need to remember. A couple things we need to do that. But we will send out more information later in the week of exactly where we're going to meet. But it'll be the same time as usual and all that kind of stuff. And we'll actually be able to see each other, and I'll be able to give you a physical bulletin. I know you're all excited about that. Anyway, so just want to remember also, the Black Lives Matter protests are going on all week. It started a week ago Friday, but the big one was a week ago Sunday, was last Sunday. But they've been meeting every night at 6 o'clock in front of the federal courthouse. And so I encourage anybody to do that. What they said is that there have been a lot of regulars, and a lot of the regulars are getting tired, and they need people to step up and take their place. So if there's other folks that would like to come, usually if you want to do both the rally and the march, the rally always starts at 6, and then they do a march afterwards. And if you do both of those things, it's usually going to be a couple hours. But you can go and attend for as long as you're able. Also, just wanted to let you know that in the bulletin there's indication of a fundraiser for the dining room. I know a lot of folks in our church have been involved in the dining room. So they're actually going to have a Cuban dinner at the dining room, which you take to go. So you need to sign up, though, for it, and then you pick it up on June 12th. And so look in the bulletin, check out the link. You can sign up for the dinner and pay for it online. Okay. All right, so there's a couple things that I just want to mention for prayer. One thing in specific, particularly, that I would like us to pray for. I want to pray for our indigenous communities in the United States, in Canada, and in Mexico, so all over North America. Mexico has been hit really hard by COVID, really severely by COVID. And it's possible that Mexico, in the end, will have more deaths than the United States. So it's really bad, especially in the Mexico City area. So we want to be praying for Mexico. COVID COVID attacked the Native Americans in the United States, in the tribal areas of the United States, really hard. In fact, if we're talking about percentage-wise, then if the tribal nations were called states separately, then they would have the top 5 states hit hardest by COVID, and then New York would be number 6. And part of the reason why that they're being hit so hard is because they're not being given the supplies, they're not being given tests, they're not being given the provisions that other states are able to have. So we want to pray and remember Native American folks. And then in Canada, actually we received a specific request from Christian peacemaker teams about Native Americans in Canada. So gas employees and mining employees are still working in Canada. They've been working all throughout the COVID crisis, and they've been working straight in the middle of tribal areas in Canada, which means that the protests have the Native American protests have continued, and in the meanwhile, and so that it's just the possibility of infection from these workers to the folks to the Native Americans up there is very real. One other thing about the U.S. and Navajo Nation specifically, there's a huge drought, a really terrible drought. So there's no running water in a large area of Navajo Nation. So I'd like us to specifically remember indigenous communities in North America, because it's really bad right now. They're honestly being hit hardest of any organized group. All right, so let's go ahead and take some time in prayer. May peace come upon our people. As Lane County opens up again, we ask for safety. May there be peace and comfort for those who are grieving and struggling right now. May there be health and protection from COVID in Mexico. May there be provision of running water in the Navajo areas. May there be supplies and aid to Navajo nations, to Native American nations throughout the United States. May there be protection for the indigenous nations of Canada. May the love and restoration of the Spirit be upon all the world. Amen.
benediction. You can follow with me in your bulletin. The mountains tremble at the presence of God, at the overwhelming power of mercy that reshapes the earth. May we too be transformed by the renewing of our minds into the very shape of Jesus' love, sent out to renew the very land and air in which we live and breathe.